that will be given in English and by Maria Papathanassiou, correct? Yes. She was assistant professor at the University of Essex for History and Modern European Studies. Please.
I'd like to thank the Union of Slovenian Historical Societies and especially Drag and Aida Skor-Abi, if I pronounce it correctly, for being in contact with me per email. So this is a paper regarding perceptions of child abuse and abused children. In the Austrian Empire, during the early 20th century, it is actually a comment, critical reflections on a speech, a detailed speech concerning this subject, child abuse and abused children. In 1907, the first Austrian Conference for the Protection of Children took place in Vienna. The second one took place in Salzburg in 1913. And we have these papers from the first Austrian Conference, which was particularly interested in what in German is called Verwahrlosung, which could be translated in English neglect or waywardness, or I'm not sure about the right translation, but I translate neglect. So, among the speakers there was a woman. Lydia von Wolfring, on whom we know very little, almost nothing. And she was the president of the Pestalozzi Verein, an association, a society for the promotion of child protection and youth welfare. We also know very little on this association, but maybe I will make more research, though for the time being it doesn't seem as though we do have archives on this. But we know that during the late 19th and the early 20th century, we have many societies built upon the Anglo-Saxon example, societies for the protection of children and youth, whereby middle-class, ruling-class women had a distinguished role to play. So the argument of the paper is that on the one side, we have, in her speech, she presents the case of around 100 abused children. And this is a very detailed speech with many concrete examples. It is, as this, she says characteristically, our remarks are not based on abstract studies, but spring from the experience of everyday life. And she gives an explanation of Verwahrlosung, abandon moral in French, which means being morally neglected, an intensive, continuous, heavy and cruel child neglect that often also refers to physical neglect and leads to degeneration and aging. So the argument is that on the one side we have this middle-class woman who is conservative in her approach, but on the other side she shows empathy and is very modern, and I would even say postmodern in her approach of child abuse. What do I mean by this? She refers to several causes of child abuse in Vienna. She accuses the state for deficient laws, for the lack of welfare policy, for laws that do not really face the problem of juvenile delinquency, and she also accuses the parents. She connects child abuse with what she calls lumpenproletarians, an indolent, she writes, promiscuous, alcoholic social group among the working class. And although she recognizes several hardships may lead people to this situation, for the most part she makes people responsible for their situation. So there is no systemic thinking that, you know, maybe the system is to accuse of this situation, that poverty should be faced, etc. So this is, as I see it, the conservative side in her approach. But on the other hand, she does bring forward, and as far as I know, such aspects are not mentioned in the literature on the actions of such societies. She does bring forward the construction of criminality in regard to children and youth. She says that children's deeds are misjudged. She says that people, the authorities, the police, the judges, they give too much credit to adults instead of children, to their tormentors, as she writes, instead of the victims. She says that laws are irrational. So I'm reading some parts of her speech. Causes and results are often confused as far as abused children's behavior is concerned. A child who is systematically deprived of food finds something, takes it in order to allay its hunger, and this is labeled as theft. So this is the construction of criminality. A child runs away from home in order to avoid continual maltreatment, and one ascertains a tendency to lead a vagabond life, because vagrancy was a crime in the Habsburg monarchy and Europe in general. When caught by authorities, the child gives the wrong name and address so that they don't send her back to her torturers, and she's called a liar. And then she says, who examines what really happened? This is another abstract which shows this construction. So the first is the misjudgment. And the second of her arguments is that the police, the judges don't have a real picture. They have the side of the adults. They give too much credit to it. Who examines what really happened? Primarily the police does, who, as we have seen, draws on testimonies of the child's legal protectors. Who then takes on the child's fate? The welfare establishments. They examine the official records, but not the child herself. And on the basis of these records, they decide whether a child is worthy or unworthy of public care, providing that there are free places in the institutions. So they had a child who was arrested, for example, and they would put credit to the adults and would send the child to the reformatory or the house of correction if there was a free place. This is a common problem. Who sees, I think this is the crucial point, and listens to the child herself? The judge does. He hardly sees the child, and if so, in the presence of her tormentors, namely the barons or the guardians, whereby the child is shaking, half dead from fear. You must always take the official records into account. And she says, we know what these official records mean. So she wants to go beyond these official records. And in regard to the law, which is a great problem, because child abuse and maltreatment was, of course, connected to criminality, to petty crime. And then, according to the law, which you probably know in the Habsburg Empire, there was this Heimatsgesetz from the 1860s, and one was ultimately, after a bureaucratic process, sent to one's Heimat. But then this is the question, what does Heimat mean? This so-called home is often a remote place in a strange land, where another language is spoken, unknown and strange for the big city youth, and the latter feels helpless and abandoned in it. We know we have many migrants in Vienna. This is a period in the 19th century and the early 20th of huge migration from other parts of the empire, and non-German speaking population comes to Vienna, but then their children speak German, and then after a petty crime they are asked to go back to their homeland, supposed homeland, the birthplace of their father in most cases, but they cannot speak the language there. So she writes, for example, in the case of AP, his home is in fact Vienna. He has been born here, he has grown up here. He never left Vienna until he had this misfortune. At the age of 16, here we see the question is put, what is a child? At the age of 16, so it's a child to commit a property crime for which, after having served his sentence, he was, according to the law, deported to his legal home community. So she's postmodern in this respect, but she thinks very much on construction and makes a case out of it. Now, how did the society work? Court officials, school authorities, other societies turned to the Pestalozzi society, and they made the society aware of separate cases, and then the society would either, or sometimes on its own initiative, but mostly through these, through school authorities, court authorities, etc., then the society would carry out investigations on separate cases of children. And this is what she pleads for, also the individualization, that we have, she says, to check individual cases of the children and not just overgeneralize. There appear in her examples many parents or guardians who want to get rid of the children, so they want to send them to reformatories. But what we see is that it seems that this is an era of transition, and that societies, as well as judges and court authorities, believe that the reformatories are, so to speak, the ultima ratio. They are not the best solution. We can see this in the cases. I mean, parents may be willing, but the authorities are not that willing. They appear, at least, to be forced to send children to reformatories in many cases, because there are no free places in these modern institutions formed by the societies. So let's see an example of a case. At the criminal procedure that took place on 8 November 1904, MP, a charwoman who lives in Vienna, was reprimanded because of loveless abuse of her son Karl, born out of wedlock. She was not married. The research undertaken found that the minor Karl P. is being neglected by his mother and that he was expelled from school. The school direction claims that the boy should urgently be taken away from the supervision and the influence of his mother, but is clearly against giving him away to reformatory, since the boy has by no means shown criminal dispositions. Our request to the Vienna Protection Society for the Rescue of Neglected Children was unsuccessful due to lack of free places, which made acceptance in one of the society's establishments impossible. And then she writes, the boy was well-disposed, well-behaved and obedient, but he was cruelly treated by his mother, who would chase him away from the house at night and would give him nothing to eat. The school spoke absolutely favorably in regard to him. We see that the children are also entangled between authorities, societies, parents, but this is a clear effort to individualize. On the other hand, there was a tendency, not obvious on her part in this speech, but obvious in other speeches, to see street children in Vienna as candidates of criminality. Children of working class children played very much on the streets, and there was a tendency at the time to see this play on the streets as very dangerous, which is a conservative approach, because we know from autobiographical records that this was part and parcel of their everyday life, and it by no means meant that the child would become a criminal. On the the other hand, there was, of course, child abuse. We have a picture of child suffering. I mean, the fact that suffering is presented through the lens of middle class, ruling class, does not mean, and this is my point, that suffering did not exist. There was undernourishment, irregular school attendance at best, and in the worst cases, of course, beating, sexual abuse. She mentions only 2 cases of sexual abuse, but I suppose there were many more, because this is a very difficult subject to come forward. Prostituting of small girls, maybe there were boys too, but in her examples, girls do come up. And what we see also in the report is that children are not passive, they react. They escape home in order to escape maltreatment. They seek the help of these institutions, sometimes themselves. And in the worst cases, they even attempt suicide. In another report at the conference, it is said that most suicide attempts in Vienna in the last year, 1906, were made by children and youth, but no more information is given. So I read this last example and then show you some photos and finish. 10 years old Rudolf P., son of a drunkard, who from time to time works as a mason, has jumped, this is a suicide attempt, from the 2nd floor to avoid being maltreated by his father. After he recovered, we took charge of this totally neglected child. The boy could neither read nor write, he had never attended school, and until then he had lived as a tramp. There is also much information on child beggars in this speech in Vienna. Since he was 6, he no more lived with his parents, but lived on begging with a band of children who were in the same situation. During the summer, the children would work in the Volksparade, which is an amusement park in Vienna, as bowling boys on the side of artists, etc. The older ones, 10 and 12 years old children, would go around selling lottery tickets in taverns at night. Sometimes they would serve prostitutes as lookouts. So petty crime, work on the street work. The above-mentioned Rudolf P. had left home because of his father's brutal behavior and because of hunger. But he liked his mother. He often waited for her in the street as she returned home from her daily work by the masons in order to give her the money from his earnings. As we took care of Rudolf, he ignored any civilized way of life. He proved to be very docile, intelligent, and grateful. In the beginning, he had a very good time. After a few weeks, this is very important, she shows an understanding to children's reaction, which is very modern. He was missing his companions, from whom he had been separated, and one day he disappeared. And then she says he's coming back and asks the society to take care of his companions as well. So children are not passive, they are historical subjects, they are social agents, and we should look at it if we explore, examine the history of such societies, as far as this is possible. So, I'm going to escape. Just a moment. I'll show some photos very quickly. The photos are not exactly relevant. They show poor children in Vienna during the early 20th century, even after the First World War, but I thought it might be nice to have. They are from the National Library. Poor children, and there is also okay. This is from the period of the First World War. So it is a period of trust and children waiting for food before a Kriegsküche, a war kitchen. And these are children in the early 20th century who are given clothes. in a philanthropic institution, poor children given clothes. And this is what we can imagine as the destitute working class family, children looking for coal among garbage. This is 1931, but this was a common child work since the 19th century at least. Also another picture. Okay. There was another photo, but anyway, there was a photo of inaugurating an institution on child rachitis. Do you say this? And I just want to say this as a... Looking at the photos of the National Library in Vienna, I saw that when you put poor children, most photos concern rachitis. So it is most you come up with. So I just wanted to give this complex picture of being between conservatism and modern views and transition, and the whole papers of the 1907 conference really support this tendency. This is a particularly detailed paper, but the other papers too, as I looked through them, support this tendency. There is also a paper on Ljubljana.
Thank you.